Coming to you from the greatest city in the world, this is the #1 showbiz podcast. It's Talk for Two. Here's your host, Matt Bailey.
Thank you, Gary. Well, everybody, today's guest, when I say pop culture icon, I really mean it. George Takei is a Star Trek legend, social media superstar, and has guest starred on just about every television show imaginable. In 2015, Takei made his Broadway debut with Allegiance, a musical based off of his experience as a child in a Japanese internment camp at the height of World War II. 62% of the 120,000 people in these camps were American citizens, Takei and his family among them. The camps were ordered by FDR shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, that musical, Allegiance, is available as a limited edition 2-DVD box set. The first disc is a performance of the show on Broadway, and the second documents the journey that Takei and his creative team took to get this powerful story to the Great White Way. You can pick up your copy at allegiancemusical.com. I'll link to it in the description boxes on talkfor2.com and on YouTube. Takei also has a graphic novel, They Called Us Enemy, which is aimed at helping young people understand the injustice that Japanese citizens faced during the war. I've also linked to that if you want to check that out. In this emotionally impactful interview, and I was sitting there just stunned, Takei details stories from his time in the camps. Some are undeniably horrific, while others were what he called warm, and I'm using his quote, memories from a truly ugly time in American history. And as his fans all know, Takei has dedicated his life and his platform to making sure such dark history never repeats itself. Here now to tell us why Allegiance is truly an American story, our interview with George Takei. George Takei, welcome to Talk for Two. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. And where are you?
Well, I'm supposed to be in New York, but I came back to Pennsylvania, and I've been here since March. Are you? You're in California, right? You've been.
I'm in Los Angeles. Yes. What part of Pennsylvania is a big state, just like California? I'm in Southern California, Los Angeles. Now, you can be near the Ohio border, or you can be on the New Jersey border. Which side or whereabouts in between are you?
We're right by the New Jersey border, actually. I'm 2 hours from the city, so I'm in the Lehigh Valley, if you're familiar. Yeah.
Yes.
So
I am. We're bicoastal. We've got an apartment in New York as well. For an actor, something that we American actors complain about. I have British actor friends who live in London, and they can work in television, film, theater, and voiceovers. Only in America do we put the two places that employ actors on the two farthest apart cities on two different coasts of the country. For theater, it's New York. For film and television, it's Los Angeles. So we have to maintain two homes, unfortunately. I have an apartment in New York, but our primary residence is here. I'm a native Angelino, born and raised in Los Angeles.
Well, I bet you're glad that when this all happened, that you were in Los Angeles as opposed to New York, because I bet you have a lot more space at your house rather than the apartment in the city.
Oh, my, yes. Brad's got his office in the far end of the house, and mine is on this end of the house. So sometimes he doesn't hear me when I call, and so I have a bell that I sound, and he responds.
Yeah, my boyfriend says my voice sounds like a bell too sometimes. So just Oh my gosh. Well, one of the big projects you had in New York, Allegiance, it's now a DVD set. It's a huge, wonderful collector's edition box set, only about 2,000, 2,500 being made. Tell me about, first, let's talk about Allegiance. What prompted you, I know you were in internment camp, what prompted you to say, I'm going to tell this story on stage?
Well, it's been my life mission from the time I guess when I was in my 20s. I actually in my teens, I learned a great deal about my childhood imprisonment from my father.
Hmm.
My father was a block man. We were in two camps. We were rounded up here from Los Angeles, and I remember that morning when the soldiers came marching up our driveway and stomped up the porch and with their fists began pounding on the front door. And my brother and I were told to wait in the living room while my parents were packing back in the bedroom. And so we were just gazing out the window, and we suddenly saw these two soldiers carrying rifles with bayonets on them, marching up our driveway. And they banged on the door, and my father came out of the bedroom and answered the door, and literally at gunpoint, they ordered us out of our home. And we were taken from our home to can you imagine the horse stables
Oh my
of
God.
Santa Anita Racetrack? Horse stables from a two-bedroom house on Garnet Street in Los Angeles, front yard, backyard, to a smelly, I mean, it was still pungent with the stink of horse manure. And that's where we had to sleep for about 3, 4 months while the camps were being built. Our shower was where they washed down the horses, and it was outdoors, so the men and I were allowed to shower first, and I went with my father, of course, and my baby sister went with my mother later on when it was a women's turn. But out there in the open air was where we had to bathe, where they washed the horses. And then we were put on a train and transported 2/3 of the way across the country to the swamps of Arkansas. And here we were, Americans, innocent of anything. There were no charges, therefore no trial, because you have to have charges to challenge in a court of law. In our case, there was no charges, so we had no trial. The central pillar of our justice system, due process, completely disappeared. It was racism and hysteria of the times. And so, but I was at that time 5 years old and too young to really understand what was going on. We were all categorized, children and old people, everybody, 120,000 of us were categorized as enemy alien, which was the most irrational thing. I wasn't an enemy. I was a 5-year-old kid, and I wasn't an alien. I was born here in Los Angeles, the son of my mother, born in Sacramento, California. My father was a San Franciscan, and yet they irrationally, without any logic, categorize us as enemy, alien, and they had no basis, in fact, for that.
It's horrible.
That was just a made-up category, and we were imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps, barbed wire fences, sentry towers, machine guns pointed at us. At night, searchlights followed us when I had to make the night runs to the latrine. I had searchlights following me. But, to a 5-year-old kid, it wasn't intimidating. It wasn't something that was humiliating. I thought it was nice that they lit the way for me to pee.
Oh my gosh.
Innocence of a child, and my father, because he was a block manager, he gave me uh, all the details of our imprisonment, and he shared with me his personal anguish and 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 outrage, one outrage after another. And so I've been on speaking engagements, as I said, from my 20s. Uh, uh, at that time, it was like the chambers of commerce, any groups that were meeting. But since then, I've been on speaking tours throughout the United States, speaking at universities and conferences and so forth. And they even invited me to Oxford and Cambridge in Britain to talk about the internment story. And so I uh, uh, last July, my memoir, childhood memoir,
Mm-hmm.
graphic memoir, was published with the title "They Called Us Enemy," and Allegiance was part of that. Uh, we founded a museum called the Japanese American National Museum. We're an affiliate of the Smithsonian here in Los Angeles. I was a chairman of the board, and I'm still a trustee of that museum. And so what we did there was we institutionalized that story. You know, when I speak at universities, it's a temporal thing. The audience may remember it, or they may forget about it. And I'm still surprised that there are so many people that I consider well read, well informed. When I tell them about my childhood imprisonment, they're shocked and aghast that something like that actually happened. So we wanted to make sure that it wouldn't die off with the generation that experienced it. Most of them have died off. My parents are gone. Uh, a lot of the majority of the people that were incarcerated are now gone. I'm one of the few survivors still alive to talk about it, and I consider it my responsibility. And so we founded this museum to institutionalize that story, and we have programs with school teachers where we get them to incorporate the story of the internment in their curriculum. Um, but that's still an academic study, and we did Allegiance because we wanted to humanize that story, so that people were able to experience the emotions, the sense of the roughness, of the anguish, leaving your home, having everything taken from you. My father said, you know, they took his business, they froze the bank account. We lost the house because the bank account that you had no access to your money, and you can't make the mortgage payment. So they took
That's
everything that they worked for to the halfway point of their lives, to have it taken from them. And it was the most lawless thing, because we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights, we have due process, we have just humanitarianism disappeared, and we were uh, uh, and without any kind of evidence, they considered us spies, potential spies, or saboteurs, or fifth columnists. When they were never able to get any evidence of any kind of activity like that. It was just sheer hysteria, and so we wanted to record that history so that it won't be forgotten. But with Allegiance and with my books, I wanted to humanize that story for people to understand that these are human beings who feel the pain, who feel the anguish, who feel outrage, and and many of them that were incarcerated, young men, turned radical, and it wasn't they that turned radical; it was the government that forced them to become radicals, and so we developed Allegiance to tell that story as a musical on Broadway. When we were developing it, I'd tell some of my Japanese American friends, that we were doing this, and they would say, "What? You're going to make a musical out of our suffering?" And because they, when you say musical, they think of high kicking, song and dance.
Right.
But music has the power to really penetrate the heart, the emotion. And so that's why we did it as a musical. And my book, my graphic memoir, essentially it's a comic book. Um, with that, I wanted to reach the young people to have them know that story because when I was in my preteens, I loved comic books. I devoured them, and at that age, you're absorbing in information through your pores,
Hmm.
and I wanted to reach that generation today, where they get exposed to the story, and they grow up knowing that this is a chapter of American history, not Japanese American history, but American history, as much American as the story of slavery or what happened to Native Americans in history. This is a part of American history that Americans need to know about as part of our American heritage, which we must never repeat again. And actually, in 1994, I wrote my autobiography called "To the Stars."
Yep.
Uh, it was a Star Trek.
Of course.
I was wearing my Starfleet uniform, looking up, on
Yeah.
the cover.
Hmm.
But with they called us enemy. I wanted to reach a youth generation because they're going to become the voters and the leaders of tomorrow. And with Allegiance, I wanted to reach people emotionally to tell the story of the young men who went from behind those barbed wire fences. They were so desperate to prove their loyalty that they took the outrage of being used like cannon fodders. And so, we told that story, but we also told the story of those that took a principled position. They said, I'm an American and I will fight for my country, but I will fight as an American. If I can report to my hometown draft board, not be taken from me in this barbed wire prison camp, but if I can report to my hometown draft board with my family back home, I would be like any American. I would be an American. I will fight as an American, but I will not go as an internee, leaving my family in imprisonment to put on the same uniform as that of the sentries up on the tower guarding over my family. I will fight as an American. And for that, they were tried for draft evasion and found guilty and transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And there were others that who refused to sign the loyalty questionnaire. And because of these irrational and cruel activities of the government, many of these young men turned radical. And so, there we wanted to tell that story. Have you seen Allegiance?
I saw it on Broadway, sir. I saw it.
Well, the Frankie character
Yes.
is one of those that the one that Keiko falls in love with.
Hmm.
He was radicalized by the government, by the behavior of the government, and um, Sammy goes to fight for this country, leaving his family in imprisonment, and so that's another kind of heroism. But the true heroes were the ones that stood strong as Americans behind those penitentiary walls. So uh, the speaking engagements and the various programs with educational institutions is to uh, make sure that the story is known And with the museum, we institutionalize it so that it remains a part of American history. But with the books and with the musical, it's to humanize that story.
So I have to ask, and thank you for sharing all of that. That is just so gut wrenching to hear, and I'm glad that you did Allegiance because I didn't know. It's kind of swept under the rug a little bit. We don't talk about it a lot. But what do you think in this current moment? How does it make you feel when you hear people comparing these COVID lockdowns to what you experienced? How does that make you feel?
Well, not just the COVID pandemic that we're living through, but what's going on at the southern border
Hmm.
is outrageous. Again, the same sort of mindless, irrational cruelty that happened to us 17 plus years ago. Um, People, I mean, we visited Guatemala. We wanted to see the Mayan ruins, but we also saw the seething poverty and the lawlessness of Guatemala. Some women have seen their husbands killed right in front of them. And these are people literally fleeing for their lives because of the violence and chaos in their country. And she grabbed her children and she tried to flee. And you can't have poverty-stricken countries across the border from the wealthiest nation in the world. And these people come to seek asylum, and instead we detain them, which is another form of putting us in, or another form of imprisonment, sort of not unlike what the Japanese Americans suffered during the Second World War. So the importance of the internment story is that it's still relevant today, and it's the same kind of mindless cruelty is going on right now. After 9/11, uh,
Right.
Truman, I mean, not Truman, Trump said, we've got to have an absolute and total banning of Muslims coming into the country, and essentially inferring that all Muslims are potential terrorists, just like we were, Japanese Americans were considered potential spies, terrorists, I mean, spies, saboteurs, or fifth columnists. It's that same mentality. There's there's no proof. Yes, 9/11 happened because the perpetrators were Muslims and they were Saudi Arabians, although there are allies. You know, but he doesn't say Saudi Arabians, Muslims, saying all Muslims are potential terrorists, and he's banned them from travel. But that also tarnished the Arab Americans in this country who have been here for generations.
Right.
And in fact, there was a Indian Sikh,
Hmm.
SIK, in Arizona who had a gasoline station, and this guy shot him. And when they tried to arrest him, he said, "I'm an American. I'm an American. I just killed a Muslim." You know that
It's horrible.
mentality.
What do we do? How can we get past it? How can we stop history from repeating itself in one form or another?
That's the thing. It's going to take a long time because we had what's called the original sin, the issue of slavery, and African Americans for 4 centuries have been struggling for equality. Just because of the color of their skin, they were considered property, and they had to. We fought a civil war to make
Hmm.
them no longer property; that they were human beings. But still, they didn't have the right to vote, and they had to struggle for that. And even when they had the right to vote, there was voter suppression, and so that struggle is going on still, despite the fact that we've had an African American as president of the United States. American African Americans have been attorney generals of the United States. African Americans are now participating in every aspect of American society, and yet, you can't be black and driving, or you can't even be black and running, as we just discovered.
Mm-hmm.
In Georgia, uh, this this young man Aubrey
Mm-hmm.
was shot and killed by two rednecks, father and son, and uh, it didn't go. They didn't go arrested for 10 weeks. 10 weeks because the victim was a black man and the perpetrator were ignorant Southern whites. And it wasn't until finally the tape was exposed publicly
Yeah.
that they were arrested. So that struggle is still going on with the African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So the Japanese American story or the Asian American story, because there's a long history of anti-Asian um, uh, prejudice in this country. Um, the Chinese started coming in the 1850s. In fact, the Chinese were involved in the building of the transcontinental railway. Building the tracks. Uh, it was hard labor, cheap labor, and the Chinese were willing to work on that, and they contributed to tying the country together, the East Coast with the West Coast, and yet they were seen as filthy and uh, dirty and carrier of diseases, and there was the yellow plague fear, which gave rise to the name yellow journalism, because William Randolph Hearst picked that up and started saying we've got to get rid of the Chinese. And in 1882, they Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, the name of the act itself was racist, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they stopped immigration from China, but then the Japanese weren't Chinese, so the Japanese started coming to work in the sugar plantations of Hawaii, and my grandparents were farmer. My mother's parents were farmers, and they came to the Sacramento Delta and farmed there. And the again the Japanese, the Chinese, it didn't make any difference. They were Asians. In 1881, here in my hometown of Los Angeles, a white woman uh, claimed that a Chinese man harassed her, and a mob formed, and they went into Chinatown and just randomly uh, uh, captured 20 Chinese men, dragged them over to the Central Plaza, which still exists today in downtown, and they lynched them, 20 Chinese men, because of one white woman's claim. I mean, that was never examined, so she could have been a hysteric who made it up.
Mm-hmm.
But because of that woman's claim,
Yeah.
20 Chinese men were lynched in the Central Plaza of Los Angeles,
And even
and so California was very much like the American South in the 1800s.
hmm and even with Star Trek, with in the '60s, it was groundbreaking to have a cast that diverse. Nowadays, I don't think we blink twice about it. But if I recall anything about Trek history, that was a big step for Asian
It
Americans,
was
for African Americans, for everybody.
exactly.
Yeah. Well.
Gene Roddenberry was a visionary in
hmm
that respect, and his philosophy was we're going to tell this story in terms of metaphors, and the Starship Enterprise was a metaphor for Starship Earth, and the strength of the starship lay in its diversity, coming together and working in concert as a team, and that philosophy is still relevant today. The diversity of this country. or the diversity of the human animal is its strength. If you can work together, work in concert, be aligned to a common goal, because the human animal is intelligent, but beyond that, we have our own distinct, personal, individual character. Some are hunters. They go out, search out, and seek information, and they seek facts. Others are gatherers who gather that fact and uh, put them together and share it. And then others are builders. They build structures, but they also gather the ideas that have been gathered and develop that into a venture. They become entrepreneurs, and then there are the outliers, the artists and the poets, and that's another group of humanity. And it's all of this, that diversity, working together in concert. That's the strength of humankind.
I love that. I want to close out with something you said actually it wasn't an interview, it was in your unboxing because it was very, very striking.
It was in the what?
In the unboxing video that you put on Facebook, where you unboxed
Mm.
the Allegiance box set. And I might be, forgive me if I'm taking this out of context, but it was just a phrase you said. It said, um, here I have it written down. It said, warm memories of uh, an ugly time, referring, of course, to the internment camp. And that's how you described the Allegiance in that box set. What did you mean by that? Warm memories of an ugly time.
It was an ugly time.
Mm-hmm.
It was a shameful time for the. My. I said I learned as a teenager from the after dinner conversations that I had with my father.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my father shared with me a lot of the details of that, and it was an ugly time. And yet, as a 5-year-old at that time, have you read They Called Us Enemy?
Actually, I didn't even know you wrote it. I knew there was a graphic novel, but this is actually the first time hearing about it, and you can bet I'm going to go pick it up because
Oh,
it
do.
sounds
Because
fantastic.
I tell that from the eyes of 5-year-old me,
Yeah.
and I have fond memories of that. Because my father was a block manager and he worked with the camp command, I guess, he was able to get some privileges. And one afternoon at lunch in the mess hall, my father told us that tomorrow he's going to be able to borrow a Jeep and take us out of the barbed wire. This is in Arkansas. And that was, such an exciting thing to go outside the barbed wire fence. But not only that, to be taking that ride in a Jeep. And so I told all my friends, about it, that we're going in a Jeep and we're going outside the camp. And so they were all eager to see if this was really true. And sure enough, they were all gathered near our barrack, and we were on the porch waiting for my father to appear. And sure enough, he came driving that Jeep and beep beep us. And so my brother and I clambered in, and my father went in to get my mother and my sister, and the boys were so envious. And then my mother and my sister came out, and we went outside the gate and took us for an incredible experience. I mean, that's the way it remains in my memory. We went through the swamps and over the bridge, and then we visited a hog farm. And I was into dinosaurs at that time, and I thought surely these big, enormous, smelly, ugly, grunting creatures wallowing in that muck, smelly muck, must be a descendant of the dinosaurs. And then we drove back to the camp. But I remember that so fondly. And now it's going to be coming out in July in hardback with a brand new cover. And I said, we've got to capture that. It's still vivid in my memory. As my father was driving the Jeep back to the camp, there was a blazing, radiant sunset, and the barbed wire fence and the sentry towers were silhouetted. And my brother had gone to sleep right beside me in the back seat of the Jeep, and my baby sister was in my mother's arm, and she had dropped off, and I was getting pretty sleepy too. But that was I was still awake as he drove back toward the camp, and so we recreated that for the hardcover book of They Called Us Enemy. So do pick up the. It's going to be coming out in June or July.
Yeah,
I think he said July. The what's out right now is in soft cover, but I have these warm, fond memories of my childhood, an innocent childhood. But there were other events that were terrifying. There were riots in camp, and the soldiers came roaring in, standing. One soldier would be driving, and two soldiers would be standing in the Jeep, aiming their rifles at us, and everybody, ran. And my father grabbed my hand, and we ran like bats out of hell. So I have terrifying memories too, but there are fond memories of my childhood behind barbed wires.
well, I want to say thank you for writing that book, and thank you for writing Allegiance. I'll leave you with my thought here. I don't know if you'll agree with this, but I think of all the issues we talked about, and I asked you, how do we heal? How do we heal? How do we move past? And I think, and change our society for good so we don't repeat history. I think the answer is art, because art reaches across and gets people to understand these complex issues. So thank you for devoting yourself artistically to changing the world and making it a better place. Thank you very, very much.
Well, I thank you for your sensitivity and also the support you're giving us. You saw Allegiance on Broadway, and you have the treasure box of Allegiance. Thank you very much, and do pick up a copy of the hardcover version of They Called Us Enemy coming out.
Absolutely. I will. Mr. Takei, thank you very much. This was an honor.
Well, thank you for this opportunity.
I gotta tell you guys, I was sitting on the edge of my seat, enthralled the whole time, staring at my soundboard as if George Takei were really in the room. It was totally mesmerizing. Mr. Takei, if you are listening to this, thank you so very much for your time. Thank you, thank you. Well, I have a story in a minute here, and before I get to that, you'll understand why I'm doing this now. Before I get to the story I want to tell you, I just want to remind you all to visit talkfor2.com, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, and to email me at talkfor2cast@gmail.com, talkfortwo.com, and talkfortwocast@gmail.com. And thanks again for listening. Now my little story to end this. A little behind the scenes information about how this show is produced. When you hear me say goodbye on air, it is not goodbye to the guest. It is goodbye to the broadcast. They don't hang up right away typically, and we spend just a minute. I give them the details of when it'll air and a time frame, and I thank them personally off air, off mic. And, we hang up from there. We don't spend too much longer typically, but, another minute or two just to thank them. And he knew we were clear because I say, and we're clear. And I like to be a man of my word, a man of integrity, where when I say we're clear, we're not recording that way in case they ask some questions or whatever. And they know something's not going to end up in the edit, just to respect not that they're going to say anything untoward, but just to respect their privacy. And what happened with George was that we ended, And we were about to end the phone call, and instead of saying goodbye, now he did this was the coolest thing. You can think I'm lying, but I'll have this story for the rest of my life, and people can believe me or not. He goes, "Live long and prosper." Click. It was the greatest thing ever. It was my should have had a V8 moment, because I should have kept rolling. But like I said, I don't do that once I tell them we're clear. But he goes, "Live long and prosper." Yes, that's Spock's line, but my God, sent chills up my spine to hear, because he did it in the Sulu voice. It was great. And you heard he got an "oh my" in the interview, and I have a friend who worked with him, said, yeah, that's just how he talks. So I will have that story for the rest of my life, that he graciously hung up the phone by going, "Live long and prosper." And before I could say the response to that, he was already off the line, because I was like, wait, I gotta get you, I gotta record you saying that. And but he was gone. It was great. So since he was gone, I will not end this in my typical way. I will end this by saying, I'm Matt Bailey. Peace and long life and long memory, so that the ugly things that we talked about here today may never repeat themselves.
You can hear more show business interviews with the stars at talkfor2.com.